and welcome to Money Reimagined. I'm Sheila Warren. In last week's show, we talked about decentralized finance, better known as DeFi. The first word of that phrase, decentralized, forms the basis of this week's conversation, which will focus on decentralized governance and decentralized autonomous organizations, better known as DAOs. We highly recommend that if you're brand new to this topic, you check out last week's episode first. The DeFi ecosystem is built on top of decentralized structures, meaning that there are no or minimal centralized parties involved. A key question the crypto ecosystem asks itself on a regular basis is, how decentralized do things need to be? And in fact, the perspectives on this question are a large part of where crypto factionalism comes from, with Bitcoin maxis on the one hand shouting that anything besides pure decentralization, quote unquote, is a gateway to doom, while other actors just as vehemently cry that total decentralization is a myth, or note that life is full of trade-offs and decentralization has its costs. Regardless of your personal views, it's undeniable that the governance underlying crypto protocols is one of its most exciting aspects, as well as the aspect that is the least understood outside of the crypto domain, and I would argue even within it. As a self-proclaimed governance junkie, I believe that as decentralized governance models are tested and mature, they will have implications well outside of crypto and the financial system. Before we get into the potential of all of this, what even is decentralized governance? Blockchain governance started off as a real-world process in which stakeholders coordinated and determined the direction of a blockchain protocol, usually with respect to its code. This happened in online chats, offline at conferences, and in other somewhat random ways. Off-chain governance systems often result in situations where some stakeholders are more powerful than others, in part because whoever shows up gets to have a say, while those who miss the memo or aren't part of the inner circle are out of luck. On-chain governance developed as a way to provide individual users with more influence in the decision-making process. This mechanism lets stakeholders, usually limited to those who hold what's called governance tokens, vote for changes directly on the blockchain. In our last episode, we walked through the basics of how these governance structures work in the DeFi context. They generally follow a roughly similar process, which in broad strokes starts with a stakeholder or a set of stakeholders issuing a proposal for discussion, getting feedback, and then calling for a vote among token holders. Governance proposals are usually coded into smart contracts that are automatically executed once they receive the requisite amount of votes. Now, on-chain governance has proven to be quite user-inclusive, but it also has limitations, in part because the amount of tokens you hold often determines the weight of your vote. So what's a DAO? Well, the main idea behind DAOs, which as a reminder, stand for Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, is that they can function without hierarchical management, utilizing on-chain governance and smart contracts. You can think of DAOs roughly as organizations represented by rules encoded as a computer program that's transparent and controlled by organization members as opposed to by central authority. We'll get into more nuance on this later. A DAO's financial transaction record and program rules are maintained on a blockchain, and via the on-chain governance mechanism, every governance token holder gets a vote in how the organization functions. So if everyone's in charge, does that mean no one's in charge? How do you create accountability in a system without formal leadership? How do you create incentives, rewards, or punishments in such a system? And how do you efficiently accommodate the feedback of every single person who has a view, however informed or uninformed it might be? To this last point, think about the last school board or city council meeting you attended, or maybe didn't, and you'll get a sense of what might happen. To discuss this head-exploding new paradigm of potential with us, we have two governance insiders with us today. We'll first bring in Rune Christensen, Chief Executive of Maker Foundation. The MakerDAO issues DAI, the world's first stablecoin on the Ethereum blockchain. And we'll then be joined by Ian Lee, Managing Director of IDEO Collab Ventures and a co-founder of Syndicate. But first, let's bring in Michael Casey, my co-host. Hey, Michael.
Hey, Sheila. How are you?
I'm okay. So DAOs, I mean, I think that last week we realized that we needed to kind of spend a little more time on this topic because the governance underlying DeFi protocols is actually really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really exciting about DeFi is it is I think, first real functioning manifestation of an idea that was out there fairly early in the whole blockchain space. I remember, the first time somebody introduced me to the idea of a DAO, like in something like 2013, and my head just exploded. I couldn't understand it. How did you have this organization that had nobody in charge that was somehow managed around these smart contracts? And I think people still struggle with it. But it's really been wonderful to see DeFi develop as it has, because now you've got something to point to. So you see, how this governance process is working. But I still think that, there's so many unanswered questions about, how does this work in the real world? how will it intersect with, mainstream law, the regular structure in which society operates, and how companies and individuals who are beholden to those laws figure out how to arbitrate with each other. It's exciting, but it's it raises all sorts of questions. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, and it also gets back to kind of your fundamental philosophy about human behavior. Do you actually trust people to self-governance capacity, or are you skeptical about that? And there are, I think, reasons to be, positive or negative maybe on that entire concept. But let's bring in our guests, because I'd love to hear from them. So Rune, let's start with you. Can you tell us just the origin story of Maker Foundation, MakerDAO, how this all came to be?
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, the thing about Maker is it's often considered to be the first DeFi project, and just generally it's very old, even in blockchain terms, right? So we really started the DAO in a sense. I mean, we started sort of the group of people that would work on the project all the way back in 2015, before Ethereum even launched. And from the very beginning, we were very clear on this, this DAO concept, which at the time was a term that Vitalik had invented that was really sort of repurposed based on these earlier concepts of so-called DACs, which was decentralized autonomous corporations. And so we got into that, basically building the Maker protocol and trying to create this an unbiased currency, right? A stable coin that is governed by code instead of central bankers. And the DAO sort of just like, it's a natural fit with this approach, because if you have this code and you have these smart contracts that govern the currency, you still need something to govern the code, basically. And that's the role of the DAO, right? And we've really, I think I've learned a lot of, the majority of sort of the painful lessons there are to learn about DAOs and about decentralization and decentralized governance. And we sort of really started off, very quickly being like, we'll just do it all decentralized. We just sort of work together however we feel like, and we'll actually create the code and create a working system. And we actually, as a group, we try to operate in this way from a very idealistic perspective for several years, and it kind of failed. And what ended up happening is just like sort of, as you would imagine, nothing really got done in terms of like really getting it done, getting it coordinated, shipping the code, building the product, right? So we actually, in a sense, we sort of gave up on trying to build like sort of bootstrap a DAO out of thin air, in a sense. And we instead said, okay, we need to organize ourselves into a foundation and then have the foundation kind of like bootstrap a DAO. So we created this centralized organization called the Maker Foundation, which then created the code. And then once the code was live, then we had this more like then suddenly there was some structure that the community could organize around. And you started getting this sense of there's actually something that makes sense here, because there are these essentially like levers and mechanisms to pull and to change and to interact with through on-chain voting, like you just described. And that creates this kind of sense of purpose and actually structure. That means it now, it doesn't just become total chaos like it started off with. And then that has evolved over many years. And I think a major sort of learning point is that it takes a lot of time, and you have to really iterate, and you have to kind of like really learn by doing and make a lot of mistakes, because a DAO is kind of like a living organism in the sense that it's a whole group of people that need to like learn collectively, right? And so a lot of mistakes were made, and a lot of sort of weird decisions were made that were then learned from. And eventually the project reached a point where we are now, which is that the foundation is actually in the process, like the very last stage of shutting down completely. So we're actually going to we're completely eliminating the Maker Foundation. And then we're entering the phase where the DAO is sort of, I guess it's become what we thought we could build overnight almost 7 years ago. And we've managed to now reach that point after all this time. And it's really exciting, to see it play out in all the different ways and all the different sort of aspects and nuances of an actual sort of, like functioning and living DAO?
So I have about 1 billion follow-up questions, but before we get to those, I'm going to focus a bit and bring in Ian on this question of centralization and this concept that you sometimes need something that is a trusted institution almost before you can then release to the wild decentralized governance. And so Ian, you tweeted recently that you think millions of DAOs will be fully autonomous, decentralized, trustless, and void of human connections, but billions of DAOs will be semi-automated, decentralized, rely on existing trust networks, and deepen human connections. So I'd love to go a little deeper with that for us, and then also tell us how this applies to Syndicate, one of the newer DAOs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that there's a history in the crypto space where like there are these kind of new inventions and terms that come around that sort of take on different meanings over time, right? Like, I think that's true about crypto. Like when there was just like Bitcoin and crypto, then there was like, this evolution of how to think about the word blockchain. Same thing with NFTs, same thing with DeFi. And I would argue that the same thing is true as well about this term DAOs, which has been around for a long time. And, folks like Christian and many other, or, Rune and many others have really pioneered kind of like different models for DAOs over the, past number of years. I would argue that we are starting to enter into a new phase of DAOs where the definition and framing of them are going to evolve. So historically, DAOs have been, referred to as decentralized autonomous organizations. We feel pretty strongly that maybe a more accurate term for these things are decentralized automated organizations. And when you frame it kind of through that lens, what that almost necessarily implies is that there is a spectrum of automation that DAOs can live on, from fully automated or autonomous, which is what they've been known of as today. And I think that, those kinds of things like MakerDAO and many others are extremely powerful in the right context. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have decentralized automated organizations, which means that parts of them are automated, but not fully automated or autonomous. And when you think, and everything in between, right? So when you think of it that way, that in my mind opens up the design space for what DAOs are, what they could be used for. And the thing that I think is really powerful about this sort of this way of framing it is that it starts to open up all these uses or applications for DAOs that might not seem like a DAO when you frame it as fully autonomous. So for example, what if the four of us started a DAO? Like, what if we just kind of came together and because we're friends and we wanted to, pool our resources together to invest in things that we felt mattered in the world, whether it's like investing in a startup or a project, or providing a grant to someone to work on something that we think is important, or, even something as crazy as, or as simple as like funding a person's education in the real world, right? Is that a DAO or not? And I would argue that that is something that lives on that spectrum of partial automation, where you can use some of these frameworks and technologies and tools to coordinate human beings and capital across the internet in very efficient and meaningful ways. And so what Syndicate is doing is it's kind of very much inspired from what Rune and Maker and so many others have done over the years, and taking that kind of mental model of like decentralized automated organizations and offering kind of this protocol to create investment DAOs across the internet globally, enabling, groups of people, whether it's like 3 people or thousands or millions potentially, to come together on the internet to invest in things that they care about. And that's what Syndicate is really at its core enabling as a protocol.
So, Ian, you suggested the 4 of us should form a DAO, right? why? I think I just sort of pull this thing back a little bit and let's talk a little bit about what the real benefits are of this kind of a structure, because I think it's tempting, particularly because of the way that the crypto community sometimes frames the pros and cons of what it's doing. Certainly the Bitcoin community, it often frames it in moral terms, right? We don't want to be beholden to this centralized entity that's going to control us. So it's about freedom. But I think there's so much more going on that you were kind of alluding to there with automation and everything else, how by removing these entities, suddenly these new opportunities arise in terms of efficiencies and everything else. Maybe you could break it down. Like, why is it beneficial that we would go away from the existing financial system to one that is run in this otherwise complicated way?
Well, I think there's two ways to answer that. So one is kind of what Rune and Maker and many others are doing, which is the fully autonomous side, right? Where, and Rune, you should jump in after this in terms of framing it the way that you would, but like the way that I look at kind of these fully autonomous DAOs are really codifying important, in DeFi case, financial primitives, right? But it could extend to other things beyond just DeFi, but financial services as software primitives on the internet that are about economic freedom globally, and not allowing that sort of system to be tampered with by by anyone, right? That is really important, and those things provide incredible value to people all over the world, and those things are going to be incredibly valuable, right? The on the other end of the spectrum, though, like it's like the 4-person DAOs, or 10-person or 30-person DAOs or 100-person DAOs, right? Which is a very different, I think, value proposition and story than like things like Maker on the other end of the spectrum. So what is that, and why is that important? Well, the world is made up of 8 billion plus people, and those people are organized into formal and informal social networks and communities and friendships and circles, right? And those micro kind of social networks and communities, they have different cultures, they have different objectives, they have different hopes and dreams, they want to do different things, they want to accomplish different things in the world, right? And so what DAO technology can offer to those communities at scale is the ability for these communities that are already existing in the real world, like friendships or alumni groups or whatever, to more efficiently coordinate human capital as well as financial capital to affect change in the areas that they care about, right? So I don't know what us four would care about. Maybe we care about crypto, and like, let's start a little mini like Rune, Ian, Sheila, Case, Michael Casey fund, and let's like support founders in the crypto space. It could be like, hey, we all care about education, so let's like pool together some of our resources with some other friends to go invest in scholarships or whatever. Like literally kind of like anything that people might want to devote resources to are very likely more efficiently and better coordinated via DAO tech than traditional financial infrastructure. Because if you think about like how you might do that today, like how would you do that? Like you'd have to maybe go on an angel list, maybe hire a lawyer for thousands of dollars. It might take weeks to kind of like set up a legal entity and get the paperwork in place. With DAO tech and tech like the tech that we're building at Syndicate, you could literally spin this up in seconds and start deploying capital immediately. And we think that is fundamentally like a net better thing for the world because of all this friction and inefficiency that exists with coordinating human and financial capital on the internet.
Yeah, I like the way you ended there with this. It's the coordination problem, right? The fact that we've got to get all this structure in place, these legal frameworks, and get everybody integrated in a room, and it's an enormous amount. It's the transaction cost, right? It's that same classic idea of the value of the firm, right?
And let me just jump in here. Like, it's not just about reducing costs. Like, me and my co-founder, we talk a lot about like what like filmmaking looked like on the before like YouTube, right? Before YouTube, content like films and stuff had a very particular like look to them. Only certain types of films were made. Only certain types of people can make films, right? Typically people with a lot of financial resources in particular areas of the world, right? Now with YouTube, you have billions and billions of content that is user generated. You have things like Charlie Bit My Finger and stuff like that is now, wildly popular. And by reducing the kind of costs and time to create content, you now have this explosion of content that is bigger than the film industry itself, right? And so in many ways, we think that DAOs are very similar, which is, yes, it can dramatically disrupt the financial system, just like other DeFi protocols like Maker and Uniswap and others. But what it also does is it unlocks totally new markets and applications and uses that were not possible in the previous world because it was too expensive or too timely to create. So for example, one of the Syndicate DAOs that we launched using Syndicate protocol is this new investment fund called Komarebi. And Komarebi was this group of 5 women across 5 different organizations in the crypto space that came together to invest in more female founders and non-binary founders in the crypto ecosystem globally. And they created that syndicate on Syndicate protocol instantly for basically no cost at all. And they are now starting to invest in more female founders in the crypto space. And like, why hasn't that happened for the 10 years that crypto has been around? It's because in order to do so, it would have cost so much money to even just get that thing out the door where it just wasn't worth it, right? And now because we can reduce the cost, we can unlock these things that always should have happened, are really important in the world, and can now happen because the barriers to entry are now so much lower.
Cool. I mean, that's a great way to think about it as, what not just disrupting what exists, but creating opportunities for that which may never have existed without this kind of barriers being lowered. Rune, I'm really struck by the fact that I wasn't aware of this. Maybe we've reported it, maybe we haven't. If not, I'll make sure that we do. The fact that the foundation, the MakerDAO Foundation, is being wound down. But it's a really interesting way to look at these questions as well, because it strikes me that the way you were describing the necessity in the first place for that foundation is that you still needed the formation of something that the average person could relate to. That was a legal construct of some sort, something that they could actually attach their trust to then formulate the governance rules, seed that structure, and then get out of the way. Is that a fair way to describe it? Do you in the sense that we can't automatically create these decentralized structures. We need some sort of transitional mechanism. Is that what's going on here? And what brings you to the point where you can decide that, okay, now we can safely pull back and distinguish that because it is truly governing itself?
Yeah, that's a really good, and also, it's a kind of question that, you can really talk for a long time trying to answer that. But I think maybe the best place to start in a way is to kind of, well, I mean, first of all, I think I was really interested in hearing Ian's this perspective of let's call it like a modern definition of DAOs, which, I mean, so I sort of look at a certain area of DeFi and blockchain, and I mean, I'm aware of things like Moloch DAO and these kind of things, which and that's actually been going on for a while. So I guess that was actually the first step in this kind of direction of there's a spectrum between, I guess, a multi-sig and a traditional DAO, and there's all sorts of stuff you can do there. But I'll try to give, let's call it the maximalist perspective of what a DAO is, right? So basically, if you have to say there's a specific definition of what it is, and when it stops being a DAO, when it sort of doesn't fit into this definition on the decentralized end of the spectrum, I think it's something like what really makes it a DAO is it doesn't depend on a person or on a central counterparty or an authority or something like that, and really there's not even there are great sort of layers of protection here, right? So that when there are some sort of there can be sort of semi-centralized things, there can be all sorts of roles and all sorts of stuff, but none of it has this kind of like critical, there's not like, it all has these kind of like redundancy and fail safes. And ultimately we're not talking about a critical reliance. We're talking about kind of like one way to do it within a broader kind of game theoretic framework that ultimately should be able to run the whole thing, right? So yeah, I mean, so for instance, well, so and actually, so bringing it all to like what, like, you know, why did MakerDAO need the Maker Foundation at first, and why is it now able to shut it down, right? And I think, I mean, the main reason why it needed it at first is because it's kind of, well, it's kind of like in the story of how it all played out with us, right? Because we really thought initially, like, if you want to make a decentralized organization, you should kind of like get a bunch of people and make sure they're totally decentralized and not really coordinating, and then let them sort of sit in a room and decentralize, or rather sit in a chat room and decentralize, right? And then it will sort of like happen by itself almost. And that was literally like, we thought, I don't know, right? It was early days, right? So we thought Bitcoin was so magical that we actually thought there's some sort of magical force we can tap into here, where if we just if we're super decentralized, something will actually emerge. And of course, nothing happens when you do that, right? You can't it's, or even if something even if something is built, there's just no chance that that's actually decentralized, because decentralized, like reaching that and decentralized in the sort of the strict definition of like a traditional DAO, right? Because it really is, it's an equilibrium. It's like, I mean, it's like a game theoretic equilibrium where there are all these different factors that all, you know, that push things into some sort of steady state in a sense, right? Which actually, if you know, with Maker, I guess the most obvious way to think about it is it's like just tons of systems and incentives and stakeholders and various types of, sort of motivated individuals acting in their own self-interest that are all working towards pushing, you know, the price of DAI towards $1, right? And a bunch of other things, having it backed by good collateral. And yeah, and like, to get to an equilibrium, you have to kind of like, right, you have to sort of build it up first, and then at some point you actually have built enough structure that now there's a possibility of an equilibrium happening. In practice, like if you just have a bunch of people just sort of magic, let's do some decentralized stuff, then really what's happening is you get kind of like a power vacuum situation where, yeah, it's kind of fun, and I've seen this happen endlessly. You know, it happens all the time that when you think you're going to build something decentralized, what you're really doing is you're creating a power vacuum, and then something super centralized actually emerges. But it's the kind of, you know, it's this thing called tyranny of structurelessness, where kind of it sort of kind of looks and you think it's decentralized, or that, you know, there's more to it than it's just some guy and a bunch, you know, and really like politics that's holding it all together.
A great expression, the tyranny of structurelessness.
I love it. Nature abhors a vacuum, tyranny of structurelessness. I think this is all, it's just such a fascinating concept, right? That in order to build something that truly, where you seed power, there has to be almost a power center to seed. And the centralized kind of function helps provide coordination and some structure in those early days to get alignment, to attract the kinds of people that care about similar enough things that they're going to be moving in at least somewhat aligned direction. And even if their own self-interest leads them to act in certain different ways, at least there's alignment on what the heck are we all doing here in the first place? Like, what is our ultimate, you know, objective? What are we trying to accomplish, and what might that be? In this case, of course, it's focusing on the DAI. You know, I think one thing that's really interesting about governance is, you know, again, you do get, I think in these, you get people who are really excited and they're constantly, you know, in all the forums and they're chatting about everything and they have an opinion about everything. Again, informed or uninformed might be the case. But then over time, one of the biggest problems in governance and any political process is actually low participation. So, and I think that's particularly true when it comes to tokens that wind up having a lot of value, because a lot of people will want to hold those tokens for speculative purposes, and they may not want to get involved in governance because it takes time to be informed, to vote, to weigh in, to educate yourself. The same is in any democracy. And so what motivates people in your experience, both of you with extensive experience, what motivates people to engage? How do you structure, how is that self-interest parlayed into actual engagement in governance of a DAO and in wading into the often messy, you know, discussions and things that happen around proposals?
Maybe Ian can go first.
I was actually going to say, Rune, you might want to go first on this.
Yeah. No, you better start. I just took the last question.
Oh, okay. Well, the reason I think Rune would have a really interesting perspective is he's further along, certainly with Maker in terms of, you know, sort of governance at the maximalist end of the spectrum, and seeing kind of like all the all the wild and crazy things that happen at that level, which I'm involved in, but not at the core of yet with Syndicate. I guess a couple things that we think about, like, again, if DAOs are on a spectrum of automation, like some of these problems don't exist at smaller group levels, right? Because you're relying on existing trust networks. And I think in those scenarios, like, the need for trustless setups, for, full kind of decentralized maximus kind of, designs and things like that, or even tooling isn't necessary, which I think it helps in some ways, like in getting those kinds of things off the ground and working in the world. At the same time, like, I think on the other end of the spectrum, like with these fully decentralized protocols, it can be both very powerful and also very difficult to manage those communities, right? Like, there's another DeFi protocol. It's not Maker, but they're sitting on a very big war chest, and even to agree on sort of setting aside a few $100,000 or $1 million to provide grants to developers in their ecosystem is like a monumental task from a governance perspective. And like, I'm sure Rune can comment on other things that he's seen, but like that doesn't seem like the way that things should work, right? Things should be a lot more like, they need decentralized governance, but they also need like this kind of agility to rapidly develop their protocols, ecosystems, communities, and things like that. And so I think that we're still in the early days of what fully decentralized governance looks like, and how that's going to work at scale and at the speed of crypto, right? So there are a lot of things that people are like thinking about, like from our view on the Syndicate side, like, we're talking with a bunch of different protocol treasuries about how they might be able to, at like the top level, vote on a proposal that carves out like a particular portion. Maybe it's not very big. It could be like, not very much money at all. It could be like 5% up to like 10 to 20% of the treasury, and then to shove that into like Syndicate DAOs that are launched on our protocol that entrust kind of the management of those like portions of the treasury to specific either members or parts of the community that can move faster, right? Whether it's like investing in startups, funding developers, building kind of awareness like in geographies all over the world. And that model is really not only attractive to these decentralized treasuries, but also highly compatible to them, right? So it starts to kind of like blend the fully decentralized autonomous, form of a DAO with like these kind of almost like sub-automated, not fully decentralized DAOs. And I think that like that's kind of, in our opinion, what we think is the future, is kind of this actually not like monolithic DAO, but more a network of DAOs that are interconnected. And like that's part of what Syndicate is building, is this protocol and infrastructure to enable, whether it's a person, a venture fund, a protocol treasury, a random group of 5 people on the internet, maybe not random, maybe people that know each other, but to create like DAOs and interconnect them to each other to achieve different purposes. And I think that that's actually a really exciting frontier for DAOs in the next few years.
It's so fascinating because we're seeing some movement where some DAOs are saying, it's a different model. Okay, let's allocate a certain percentage of treasury or a certain amount, whatever that amount might be, in some cases, large or small, whatever it is, for a certain purpose. Governance votes on that. We then create an organization, maybe it's even a C Corp or an LLC or something kind of very traditional, right? Around that, we assign a board or whatever kind of governance, a very traditional, typical kind of corporate governance structure around it. we've agreed as a community that we want to kind of dedicate, this amount of funds to this exercise, whatever it is, and then we'll empower, whoever we, as part of the proposal, put on top of that thing. But I love the idea of actually creating almost this chain of DAOs in a way, or mini DAOs almost, where, to your point, like a network, where you're saying, no, that will still remain a DAO in its kind of essence and structure and organization and governance. It's just that it will have a smaller coordination. It won't have the same coordination problems or free rider or whatever other kind of issues might arise in these giant communities that just kind of lead to the inability to actually move, let alone move efficiently, let alone move in crypto time, to your point.
Yeah, and I think that like when I keep referring back to the spectrum, like that also implies that like organizations can have different DAOs across that entire spectrum, right? So for like a DeFi protocol treasury, as important as one is like Maker and other systems, you don't want to entrust that to like a few people. You want like full decentralized governance where it is, something that can't be like tampered with, by any one person or authority, right? And so that totally makes sense at like, at that layer. And what I think, part of what Syndicate does is highly compatible to that. It starts to like kind of offer, ways to sort of start to segment that and like bring DAOs to life, and also coordinate with protocol treasuries in ways that we believe is necessary as part of this like next evolution of the ecosystem.
Rune, would love to hear from your experience and thoughts on this. Again, as one of the most voluminous senior DAOs, would love to hear tales from your experience.
Yeah, it's not so often I even get to sort of talk about the DAO concept, so I just have like, it's sort of like an endless stream of things and experiences I want to
we love it.
Sort of rattle off. But well, so first I want to talk about one sort of a central thing that comes up very often, which is like, participation and voter apathy, which is actually a problem we're dealing with. Like in Maker specifically, it's very often sort of considered when people talk about voter apathy, because there's not a lot of voting turnout. And it follows sort of strange patterns that I don't think people would have predicted beforehand. And but fundamentally, I think and there was this earlier point, right, that like DAOs also, DAOs that are controlled through governance tokens, where the more you own, the more you decide. They have this kind of, they have this what do you call it, like like I guess like capitalist element to them, right? That like it's the rich people who own all the stuff, they make all the decisions, right? And there's actually this kind of extra factor in Maker and sort of Ethereum based DAOs, right, which are the Ethereum gas fees, right, which actually add a whole extra dimension where any person who wants to vote in Maker, they have to pay quite a lot of money even to vote at all, right? There were times where it was like $50 to vote, and there were like really important votes that have to pass, and people just like begging someone like vote. I mean, if you're some guy with like a few tokens, you shouldn't go and pay $50, right? So it becomes all about like the whales, basically, that there's like a few really big holders that make a lot of the actual votes that execute stuff and sort of get things done on chain. But that by itself, that's not ideal. And the solution is basically delegation, rather. That's sort of the common, that's sort of the tradition. That's something that's proven to work to some extent. We actually don't have that implemented in Maker yet, but it's coming quite soon. But what we did instead, and basically the reason why we don't have delegation, is because we focused on a different element of it, which was, we didn't focus so much on let's try to sort of like optimize the actual voting itself. Instead, let's try to optimize essentially the funnel of what decisions even get put up for a vote. So in Maker, like we have a lot of decisions, like really big decisions that were done in Maker, such as like setting long-term rates for collateral, and like deciding sort of millions of dollars of exposure to collateral, that were actually decided based on proposals made by some random person on the forum, basically, who just like maybe have no MKR at all, or maybe have just a little bit of MKR. And what really drives them is basically they're just a kind of like enthusiast, basically, or like they're doing it because they I guess for the most part, it's because they have MKR and they're sort of trying to help the project as a whole. But and then there is this whole funnel where there are multiple sort of rounds of how to like processing. First, you have to, in Maker specifically, right? First, you have to go through a forum poll, for instance. That's like a very common process. And so forum polls, they're actually like democratic. So that's like one person, one vote. So you have this kind of filter where even if there's like a whale that holds all the tokens, if they can't get through the forum, they might actually have a hard time to get a real vote up. And I think this kind of mechanic, I mean, then there's like, yeah, I could talk about so many other mechanics like that. But the point is that there's this, you know, you can create this a lot more like nuanced decision-making process that involves a lot more stuff than just the actual vote and the actual execution. And I think you can sort of compare that a little bit to like you have Donald Trump in the White House, and then the people who really decide stuff, you know, those are the guys that decide what goes on his table to sign, right? And that's kind of where we, you know, where I mean, we recognized early on that if you need to really focus on that, because otherwise you could so easily have these like hidden power structures that just centralize around deciding what even goes to a vote at all, right? Okay, so yeah, I mean, sorry. So the whole point actually I want to make with all of this is that it's actually somewhat related to what Ian was talking about, where like it's so clear in these smaller scale DAOs and smaller systems that the thing that's going to drive people to do good and sort of participate is sort of their existing relationships and their sort of that bond and the trust and so on. And to some extent, I mean, when you scale it out to like a full scale DAO, I actually think you can make the same argument and say there is some requirement for what I would basically call like altruism, essentially, where there has to be some sort of like people that are in it for sort of the greater good, or some sort of like belonging to the community, or sort of being a part. And if a DAO was purely sort of like, you know, economical machine, you know, like humans that just like, yeah, they're like acting like robots trying to make money, I don't like, you know, theoretically it could work, but it could also very easily blow up basically. And in practice, I don't think it could work at all, right? And so I just think it's interesting that even when like, so it's to some extent, it's kind of this, it works very differently at different scales, but it is actually about sort of the humans involved in the end. And that's kind of what, you know, that's been one of the big lessons that we learned in Maker, basically. They're like, the humans are big, you know, they're kind of in the end, they're the thing. It's a bunch of humans.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
even just today, people were like, no, everything is going to be autonomous and we don't need human beings. And I'm like, but that's pretty fascinating that you say that at the Maker level, Rune. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's still all these ambitions to kind of like you want to lock down stuff, and if you can automate things, you absolutely want to do that. But then you actually get this kind of the question of like, who's gonna sort of watch the machine and turn it off if it, you know, spins into something you didn't intend it to do, right? So yeah, so that's the whole thing. But so another point I wanted to make is because I just think it's really interesting off what you were talking about, Ian, about these like DAOs connecting into DAOs and sort of like portioning stuff to DAOs. I mean, because it made me think about one of the big sort of new features of MakerDAO, of Maker governance, basically, that actually is a central element of the foundation shutting down, right? Which is a little bit similar to this. So it's something that, and it's like a community introduced. It's basically the community sort of figured out, what are we going to do when the foundation is gone? Because the plan has always been that the foundation would shut down, right? So they came up with this concept they call the core units. And so a core unit is essentially kind of like, it's like, it can actually be sort of anything you want it to be, but obviously there's at least one person involved. And it's kind of like a team or like a group or a person or like a manager who then, like fund manager who then deals with money basically, right? Or budgets essentially. So it's like a place where you can put a budget to get something done. So then what happened is the Maker community were then able to basically create this concept of core units and then accept proposals from so-called facilitators who like basically facilitate a core unit and create a proposal to the DAO to get some sort of budget, and then actually pay, you know, smart contract developers to do smart contracts to make sure the thing doesn't explode from the technical perspective, and risk professionals to make sure that the risk function works and you know, proper financial decisions can be made, and things like communications and almost like an HR thing where there's like this internal control element of like making sure that the other core units don't spin out of control, and a whole bunch of other things. And there's like tons of these proposals happening, and it's kind of like a gold rush right now because there's a lot of budget available, and I think very soon that'll change. But that really reminded me of this concept of like, right? It's kind of like you can't just make it, right? The DAO can't like by itself hire every individual risk analyst, or even like, I don't know, buy every single individual risk assessment, right? On a sort of manually with votes, right? That's just totally impossible. So you need to delegate, not just delegate votes like I was talking about, but also kind of like actually delegate your financial powers and your economic activity. The one really big difference, I guess, is that these core units, they could take any shape, but in practice, what ended up happening is they all took the shapes of like traditional companies, basically. So they all were like, people just like, we need, if we're going to have a face out there, we want like, we need to worry about liability. We need to worry about healthcare for the Americans and all, taxes, I guess, actually, especially taxes is a big one. So that ended up just like totally, that's just a bunch of companies. And I think that's kind of funny because that's kind of going full circle to some of the early DAO thinking of, you have the DAO and you have actually now I'm thinking about the DAO specifically, right? Which was this whole idea that you have the autonomous DAO and then you have these service providers that are companies that then get paid to do stuff. So I thought that was an interesting analogy.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about how creative we're going to be able to get with some of these systems. But right now, when you think about a DAO employing someone, for example, right, and the ability for a DAO to kind of eliminate a contract by putting a proposal through governance, and like the stability you can provide certain kinds of efforts or initiatives can be challenging. Because let's say you decide, okay, we're going to experiment with, I don't know, I'm trying to give an example. We're going to hire some kind of role, right? And we're going to have this person come in and, we're going to evaluate them on a periodic basis, and all of governance is going to vote on that. Who's taking that job? Because they're like, well, do I have a job? Do I not have a job? Who's my boss? Is my boss everyone? Is it thousands of people? Like, how do I make the case that I'm doing a good job? How's it, what is my incentive to actually do this, right? So it becomes really interesting. You think about traditional concepts like corporate law or risk, to your point, or liability, or even just basic employment. And so I do think when I think about how decisions are made, well, it's kind of 2 points. One is I think about the difference between ballot measures, and I live in California, so we have, every election, there's like 5,000 that feels like ballot measures that make it to our ballot, because these are, the way you do that is you go out and you get a petition, and like a certain number of people have to sign it. It's a very big number. Then it gets put directly to a direct vote by citizens who have to kind of agree or disagree on this thing. Half the things that come through, most people I know have no interest in voting on. Like, I don't know what that thing is. Why is it my job to educate myself about this? So you get an element where you can over time almost calibrate to what sorts of things the community wants to vote on, and what kinds of things the community is like, why are you wasting my time with this? I don't even know what this is. I don't really care. I want someone else to decide. And so I do think over time with some of these giant communities, you're going to see trends and directions of travel, the things that get a lot of engagement and tracking that, the things that get very little engagement. And those are the things you might wind up outsourcing to either, Ian, to your point, to kind of a mini DAO or a network of DAOs or smaller DAO, or even a traditional C Corp or LLC or trust, or, whatever kind of form where you hire, staff and you have a board of directors or whatever it is, and you kind of run that stuff outside of whatever the community is indicated they're not interested in. But the interesting thing to me is how much this can shift and change over time as token holders enter and exit a community. And that's sort of their choice, right? Because in order to have vote, to have stake, you got to be a participant. You have stake in the game. In most of these cases, you actually are, like, the value of the underlying token is of critical importance to you. And so you feel engaged in it because you do have some financial commitment at stake within that system. And when that goes away, well, then so does your vote. So it's an interesting kind of capture model, I think, that that you don't see really anywhere else. You don't see this in the kind of ordinary political process, even though the analogies to the regular political process are quite profound, I think, and quite direct. So yeah, and there's an interesting question here, and I think Michael, I'll turn it to you. I mean, just I'm thinking a bit about kind of legacy institutions and traditional models and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I was just thinking, clearly traditional companies, let's think about finance, for example, because here we are in the DeFi is, regardless of where we're going with it, it's necessarily a challenge of some sort to the existing financial system. And we're constantly barraged with conversations about, okay, banks are getting in, or, you know, this hedge fund's getting in, on and so forth. But can this system essentially bend to their needs, or can they bend to the needs of this system? Is there a framework within this where these very traditional centralized corporations, banks, hedge funds alike, can feel comfortable with, you know, these kinds of structures? And, you know, for example, like a smart contract that executes on a particular deal, if they wanted the opportunity to arbitrate that but couldn't, is that going to be a problem for them? Since, you know, you came from a very large traditional bank, maybe you could just, you know, put that into perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's kind of two ways to think about this. One is at the DeFi kind of protocol level, and then the other is like these sort of mini DAOs, right? That we've been talking about, where they, you know, often kind of model after existing trust relationships and social networks. So on the DeFi side, I mean, I think, you know, Rune probably knows quite a bit about this, but there are many other protocols, whether it's like Compound or Aave or, you know, others, where, you know, traditional fintechs and banks and others are all now sort of exploring this question, like, can we leverage DeFi protocols to enable our users and customers to do X, Y, and Z, whether it's like, you know, get a loan, utilize stable coins to move money, generate, you know, crypto yield, DeFi yield that is higher than the traditional system. And I think that there is growing interest in that. Maybe not from like the Citigroups like I came from, you know, or the Goldmans necessarily of the world. Maybe initially like more of the fintechs, you know, especially like, you know, crypto friendly ones, whether it's like Square and Robinhood and PayPal and things like that. My guess is that it's going to happen. I think that, you know, systems like Maker and others have been in the wild for a long time. They've been battle tested to a large degree. I mean, they've survived many you know, of these bear market pullbacks and things like that, and shown a great deal of resilience. And so, you know, maybe it's not tomorrow, maybe it's not even in a few years, but I think in the long arc of things, we're going to see more and more fintechs and ultimately traditional banks being powered by DeFi protocols on the back end. Otherwise, they're going to not be around in like 50 to 100 years. I mean, I really think that DeFi is kind of the Kodak moment of the financial services industry. And that's what I was telling people at Citigroup, even when no one would listen. I think the other thing to think about is like, are there bridges to the traditional world in the near term where maybe we don't have to wait, you know, for a long time for traditional institutions to start to adopt DeFi and DAO technology? And that is part of what Syndicate as a platform and a protocol is doing, which is, you know, right now we have the ability, our protocol enables anyone on the internet to create an investment focused DAO among any number of people, whether it's, again, one person, 5 people, 1,000 people, 1 million people, even though, you know, there's quite a bit of work to do to get to like those larger scales. But also what we already have is we built up legal and operational infrastructure where we can snap legal entities into DAOs. And why is that interesting? Well, for a couple reasons. One is by snapping a legal entity into a DAO, if the user wants it, no pressure at all if they don't. But if they do, that means they can sign legal agreements in the real world, whether investing in like startups that are not crypto, whether that's employing someone, whether that's like entering into some agreement like that you have to like physically sign or digitally sign. And those kinds of like giving those, like the DAO, those kinds of powers enable it to cross over to the real world and not solely live in the digital and crypto world, which is really interesting. And where that becomes particularly relevant, as like related to your question, Michael, is that sometimes those kinds of things like a legal entity and the ability to kind of like wrap around that the appropriate legal protections, kind of like what Rune was talking about, where like you create these C corps or LLCs or whatever, is that those are necessary conditions for other people to participate in those DAOs. So for example, like, we've set up multiple syndicates now where folks like the Kleiner Perkins of the world and other traditional investors have actually invested in these DAOs. And that was only possible with that kind of audience and capital because we snapped a legal entity into it and we made it kind of legally recognized as a legitimate organization powered by DAO technology behind it. And so I think the what I'm saying is that the hybridization of like fully decentralized and partially, I guess, like automated or whatever, that's what's going to enable the acceleration of institutional players to adopt this technology. Like, for example, Syndicate could create a Syndicate DAO, and that Syndicate DAO's sole purpose, which could be managed by a professional manager, could be just to attract capital from like banks or other people and deploy that into Maker, as an example, right? And so in that kind of setup, it might be more likely that certain organizations or banks or whatever might be more comfortable like interacting with Maker or some of these other DeFi protocols through like a hybrid, organization that, might be crypto native in terms of their tech stack, but like legally recognized and protected as an organization, and use those kind of like almost hybrid new intermediaries to accelerate their ambitions to, leverage these new protocols. And so I think that is an area that we're going to see more of, whether it's like, you leveraging, things like Syndicate, or frankly, like, Maker and Aave and Compound and some of these others spinning up centralized, companies effectively to do those kinds of services on the network. Like, I think that is kind of the future of the space as it relates to like the integration with the real world.
Yeah, like a bridging mechanism. I want to shift gears, and just we're running out of time here. We'll have to wrap up in a moment, but I just want to shift away from finance. So we're constantly focusing on, okay, DeFi became this proven world, financial world for DAOs. But Ian, you and I, in fact, some time back, we talked 6 years ago about microgrids and solar microgrids and so forth. And it's just, it's come back into the world where I'm involved in this. Sheila and I are working on some stuff in terms of ESG, but something occurred to me the last couple of days, and I think it's worth exploring with you guys. And that is like DAOs as functions for things like solar microgrids. And the context I'm thinking of here is this big announcement this week in El Salvador. So, there's a big opportunity now. Bitcoin investors, Bitcoin participants are being invited into El Salvador to do things. And I think, as we've been saying in this program for quite some time, there really needs to be a very concerted strategic move from miners to work with energy policymakers to prove out this idea that, Bitcoin could actually be a driver of green energy expansion by essentially underwriting the development of these things. But you really want them to also achieve some of these other things that we talk a lot about: financial inclusion, and of course, again, this green energy solution. So, and also, by the way, decentralizing the electricity grid, which leaves us less vulnerable to things like that Colonial Pipeline had. So there's this really interesting meeting of objectives that I think could be playing out here. But I would like to think that the last thing you really want to do is just create a mechanism for a authoritarian government to essentially capture all of that incoming funds for their own, reserves and coffers. That you'd want to create a system whereby these energy systems are community-based, that there is a means by which, if there are payments being made in Bitcoin or any other crypto for that matter, to these systems, that these local communities aren't captured by, the big village head who's answering to the local political party or whomever, that you truly do spread the wealth. Are there lessons to be learned, is where I'm going with this, from what DeFi has achieved in the financial realm to something like that, to the developing world, to this other area that Sheila and I spent a lot of time focusing on? Maybe to you, Rune, what are there lessons we can take from that to this much more sort of localized, developing world environment?
So, I mean, I think the overall point, I actually don't I can't sort of immediately think of some sort of direct lessons, I guess, but I think rather I think that this is something, this is something that's been clear, I think, for many years, that like in the developing world and in, in places where there's a lack of rule of law, suddenly like DeFi and DAOs and blockchain, it takes on a whole other meaning, because it starts to actually, it starts to actually fulfill some of the role that the legal system itself, isn't even filling, right? And I actually think that's why I often say that the multi-sigs are kind of like this, there's going to be one of the biggest impacts in the world. Once developing world just learns how to use multi-sigs, that's going to make such a big difference. Because there's this I remember learning about this in business school, basically, that one of the big risks in like some of the African countries that just have this problem of sort of jump starting their economies, is that it's just like there's so low trust, essentially. So like if you start a business with someone else, you don't have a legal system, you don't have a bank. All you can do is like you can pull some cash, and it's just so like it's so tempting for someone, for either of the people working together, let's say the two people working together, right, to just take the cash and run anytime they have a chance, right? And that is like, that exact problem is like a huge driver of why you don't see as many opportunities even being taken, and why you have so much sort of like just like you run into so many issues when you don't even have a functioning legal system, or sort of a functioning sort of web of trust, right? And just a simple multi-sig can completely sort of fix that, right? And really like take the role of an entire legal system, an entire sort of a court enforcement system, and banks with accounts and all this stuff. Like all you need is just like literally the simplest thing that's been built with blockchain, other than like Bitcoin itself, right? So I think the more advanced stuff like DeFi and like insurance, and that's just going to take things to an even more sort of amazing level, right? In terms of the possibility to do leapfrogging, right? Where you can just like jump entirely past having a legal system at all. Maybe, at least with some things, right? Although I certainly don't think it can sort of like solve all the issues. I'm very much in the camp of like, you still need the legal system, you still need all the normal stuff, and DAOs, they can sort of play specific roles, but they definitely cannot play all of the roles at all.
How about you, you're looking at a lot of investment opportunities. Are you seeing things outside of DeFi, such as, the scenario I just described?
Yeah, look, like Syndicate is actually not just a for-profit investing protocol. There are parameters of the protocol that enable people to create investing DAOs that have zero fees and zero profits, like meaning that it can be used for philanthropic donation or grant making purposes. So, we're starting to, talk about partnerships with different like large NGOs about how we might be able to distribute grants around the world to people that are doing important work in areas of like medicine or whatever, which is really, really powerful when you think about how would they do that today? Like, how would they distribute even $50 to someone in India or Africa or whatever to do something really important, like deliver, vaccinations or something like that through the traditional banking system? Like, that is not super straightforward. I guess I have a couple thoughts on this. Like, with Komarebi, right, it's investing in female and non-binary founders all over the world, like, internationally. That's really important. We're also working with a group that will be doing something very similar in other underrepresented minority communities. We also launched another Syndicate DAO earlier this week called Fiat Lux DAO, that bought an NFT from UC Berkeley, the first NFT that represented sort of Nobel Prize winning research in the area of cancer research. And that the proceeds of that are going to fund more scientific research into the UC Berkeley community. And so like, what is that? Like, that's not really a DAO. It's not really investing. These are just people coming together on the internet to allocate resources to things that they care about as a community, whether that's a community of 5 people or 1,000 or 1 million people. And I think that is a really big, it's going to be a really, really big thing in the coming years, where everyone on the internet can become a investor. And these people can organize, as Jesse Weldon likes to call them, as investment clubs on the internet using, crypto and DAO technology. And the implications of that and the impact of that are profound. The other thing that I would mention is that a lot of these like legal structures that are being created, it's super interesting. And actually, like, I've been following what Maker's been doing as a lot of inspiration. I think they are pioneering, along with a few other projects, like what the future of crypto in general is actually going to be, where you create sort of like temporary centralized structures, you transition some or all of those things into decentralized DAOs, and then maybe, like, coming full circle, you then use that to then create new centralized entities and structures to go after things that centralized entities and organizations are really well purposed to go after. And I think that, like, where this is all landing is like, like, that's going to happen across, or should happen pretty much across, every single protocol, where, like, they may look like a new, not just corporate structure, but like almost like conglomerates, like, where conglomerates have these, like, the top level organization, and they have all these different sub business units that may or may not be kind of like, closely managed. And now you introduce like a decentralized treasury and other kind of DAOs within that thing. And I think that like hybridization of these like corporate DAO models is where the world's going in terms of like DeFi and beyond. So it's going to be really, really exciting to see, how those things kind of evolve, and the type of, pioneering work that Maker and so many others are doing, that are going to effectively form these playbooks for, how others should kind of think through doing something similar.
It's related to sort of the interaction between DAOs and code and then the real world, right? Because that's something we've been really focusing on in Maker for many, many years, because of the fundamental question of how do you hold real world collateral. And so there's been a lot of companies actually working on like how to crack this problem and how to actually securely hold collateral in the real world, such as real estate, yet use it in a completely decentralized organization that doesn't even have like a legal entity, right? And so what we've actually achieved is that there is a community member, like a company basically that's it's proposing basically onboard, like, acting as kind of like an originator that'll onboard and basically loans into Maker. And it's set up a structure that's using one of the top trust companies in the US called WSFS. I'm not sure, WSFS, that people call them, right? It's WSFS. I'm not sure what the abbreviation is for, but what they've actually created is like a trust structure, where in the trust structure, there is like a reference to Maker governance. So it's a trust that will only take certain actions if they go and actually look on the blockchain and find a successful vote instructing them to do that thing, such as performing a liquidation, or like paying out the money, or sort of like amending the credit agreement or something like that. So I think that's, to me, that is like a really tremendous. So it's not live there yet, unfortunately, but the documents have been approved and have sort of created, and they're all available in the forums. You can actually check them out on the Maker forums. And it's like, I think it must be the first example ever of this kind of like full circle, where you not just have, you have a DAO actually reaching out into the real world and having this kind of like real world legal agency through a trust, yet being itself actually being decentralized, and the entire thing end to end is like in compliance with the law. And I know it was very difficult to make, but I think it's pretty cool. People who are interested in that, I would definitely encourage, go and actually read the legal documents, because it's there for people to basically read and copy if they wish to.
That is absolutely fascinating, Rune. I'm gonna check that out.
I love, by the way, what you're doing, Rune, with Maker, and there are other projects that are doing kind of similar things, whether they're coordinating, learning from you or not. But like, I think that there is this, there are a lot of folks and projects where they kind of decentralize the protocol, and they're like, like, bye. And what those projects end up finding is like, they can't get certain things done. And like, and so I think that the communities, at least in my opinion, that have made the most important progress are ones that have kind of realized like, hey, look, we have these problems, we need to get them solved. Like, how are we going to solve them? And like, a lot of those things can't be fully solved through just pure, on-chain governance. Like, they need to get creative. And sometimes to get creative, you need to create, new companies and new entities to go after those things that need to be solved. So I think honestly, like that's really the future of all of crypto and DAOs, is like this kind of utilization of these different entities and different tools to achieve the same end purpose. And like, it's been super messy, and I'm sure Rune, I don't know, man, you must have aged like 10 years in the past 5 years or whatever, but like, it's really kind of like pioneering the playbook for how all projects, I think, should build themselves.
Well, I'm afraid that we're out of time. I know we could go another hour on this topic. It's just endlessly fascinating thinking about the possibilities and potential and how these different models are going to wind up working in consonance or in concert together to kind of move us forward. I thank you so much, both of you, for helping to shed light on this really less understood aspect of this entire ecosystem, and one that I think is so incredibly powerful. Really grateful to both of you, Rune Christensen of Maker, Ian Lee, IDEO and Syndicate, and of course to my host, Michael Casey. Thanks so much, Michael, for being here again today. Stay tuned next week for another episode of Money Reimagined.